Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I'm back again today with another video. The topic of this video is going to be discussing Blake Griffin and essentially his future in the NBA and where I think that he should go. Now, what is the thing that's motivating this video? Basically, if you haven't checked it, you should Google it. His interview from last night on court after their big win. I think they won by like 2 points right at the end, and Blake sort of saved the day for the Pistons, and this interviewer pulls him aside on court and he's kind of says to Blake, like, how about that win? That wasn't that awesome? And it's something to that effect, sort of expecting Blake to be real energetic and happy. And Blake basically, he doesn't say this verbatim, but he essentially says, like, yeah, our team sucks. We shouldn't have to be in games this close. We should be winning more frequently. We are immature and we don't finish down the stretches of games, and we don't close, and we basically don't play the right way. Now, he didn't say all of this that bluntly, but he said a lot of things that he was basically negative and he wasn't really happy whatsoever. And when he's kind of rattling off all these things that are wrong with the team, then right at that moment, Reggie Jackson comes over and tries to do sort of like a photo bomb of the back of the interview, like much like how Chris Bosh used to do to LeBron. He sort of like puts his head up right in front of the camera and tries to do a funny face, and Blake sort of smirked at it, but it was more like, "Oh, dude, you picked the worst timing to do this you could have possibly picked." And so Blake kind of does a half smile, and then Reggie, who obviously doesn't really know what's going on, leaves. But basically, it seemed like Blake was pretty unhappy, and I feel like that interview was essentially translation: "Please get me out of here. I hate playing in Detroit." That being said, this is sort of a preliminary video to do some trade possibilities for Blake Griffin, where he might end up going if the Pistons do decide to trade him. Currently, I think the Pistons are like 21 and 27, so their record is not great. They thought that they would be a playoff team this year, and so far they are not. They probably will not make the playoffs. I think they're like around 3 games out of the 8 seed right now, but they're in the mix with like three or four other teams to get that 8 spot. So I really don't see it happening with the current core. I feel like they're probably going to finish like 38 and 44 or like 37 and 45 or something like that. So I don't really see them making the playoffs, but with all that being said, I think Blake deserves to play on a playoff team and do well and be in a situation to set him up for success. Okay, so with all that being said, now I'm going to get into some proposed trade possibilities that I came up with for Blake Griffin, going to some teams. Okay, so for this first trade, I have Blake Griffin going to the Miami Heat, and oh, let's see here, along with um, a first round pick probably, and then in exchange the Pistons receive Kelly Olynyk, Dion Waiters, and Josh Richardson. Now I feel like this is actually a pretty good deal for the Pistons and what they're getting back. The contract money adds up pretty evenly. You know, they're giving up Blake Griffin, who you'd say is their best player, but in return they're getting Josh Richardson, who I think is like 23 years old or 24. He's scoring like 18 points a game with 5 rebounds and 5 assists a game, or 4 and 4, I think. Shooting pretty decent percentages, so you're getting a really nice young guy to build around, especially just considering the Pistons are so uh, devoid of depth on their team. Like they're starting Reggie Bullock and like this guy named Bobby Brown on the wings. They just really don't have anything or anybody who can play and be that competent on the wings. So they really need shooting guards and small forwards, in my opinion. So in this trade, you replace your small forward with Richardson. You replace your shooting guard spot with Dion Waiters. You plug in Olynyk next to Drummond to fill in Blake's spot at power forward. And along with that, I think that that's a pretty fair trade. Now, again, as I was saying a second ago, you could put in a draft pick on either side. You know, maybe Detroit thinks that Blake is worth more than that, so they demand a pick from Miami. That could happen, or maybe Miami thinks like we're giving up a pretty sizable amount of assets, like 3 guys who are all pretty decent rotation players. We need a pick from you. Maybe Miami has to give Detroit a draft pick. But I see it just as these players, it can be pretty fair. Again, Olynyk, Waiters, and Richardson for Blake Griffin. You add a lot. You add depth if you're Detroit, and for Miami, you get finally a star that can be the centerpiece of your team. Your starting lineup after this probably looks something like Dragic. Probably Wayne Ellington I'd pick as the starting shooting guard. And then Justice Winslow at the small forward, Blake power forward, Hassan Whiteside center. This is assuming everyone's healthy too, because Dragic has been injured as of late, and so if you haven't heard about Point Justice, Justice Winslow's been playing point guard, but this is sort of like an assumption like next season when everyone's healthy, that's what the lineup would look like. Again, well, actually, Wayne Ellington might be gone, but let's say he stays, or they put in Rodney McGruber to the starting lineup. Rodney McGruber, your starting lineup would look like, again, Dragic, McGruder, Winslow, Blake Griffin, and Hassan Whiteside. Are you going to make the Eastern Conference Finals with that starting lineup? No, but are you probably for sure going to make the playoffs and probably lose in the first round? Yeah, but I think that's really all Miami is striving for at this point, so I think that they'd be fine with that. Moving on to my next trade scenario for Blake, I have Griffin going to the Phoenix Suns, and in exchange, I have, let's see here, I have Detroit receiving Ryan Anderson, Josh Jackson, and Dragan Bender. Now, this is sort of a trade that I think Detroit would only accept if they maybe got like a draft, well, not necessarily Phoenix's first round draft pick in this upcoming draft, but maybe a future first round pick or like 2 second round picks or something, because I feel like just getting Ryan Anderson, Josh Jackson, and Dragan Bender back isn't enough. But so basically, you have Ryan Anderson's $20 million that comes off the books 2 years sooner than Blake Griffin's contract. Along with that, you've got Josh Jackson making $6 million, and that actually comes off the books a year sooner than Blake Griffin's as well. And then Dragan Bender, this is the last year of his contract from his rookie deal, so he'll be coming off the books this year if you don't want him back. But you get Ryan Anderson, who can fill in for Blake Griffin at the power forward spot in the starting lineup if you want him to. Then you get Josh Jackson, who adds to their wing depth. He'll probably start right away at small forward. He's a promising young player. He hasn't really tapped into his potential yet in Phoenix, but maybe a fresh start will kind of reset him and get him to play better, maybe more motivated, because this is sort of like strike two if he were to go to Detroit. Like he would really need to get his act together and start playing better in order to prove that he belongs in the NBA. Same sort of goes for Dragan Bender, who was the number 4 overall pick in 2016, I believe. 2016, he was the 4th overall pick, and he was supposed to be the next Kristaps Porzingis, but he sure hasn't shown that so far. But again, maybe a change of scenery and sort of a wake-up call will make him play better. That would be the hope from Detroit's perspective. But again, to summarize, I think that they would want 2 second-round picks or a first-round pick as well. Probably not this year's first-round pick to make this deal fair. As for Phoenix, you get Blake Griffin, who's probably instantly tied for the best player on your team along with Devin Booker. Your starting lineup after this probably looks like Isaiah Cannon or DeAnthony Melton starting at point, depending on what they decide to do. And then Devin Booker, TJ Warren, Blake Griffin, and DeAndre Ayton. That's a pretty good team and has the makings of a team that, maybe doesn't make the playoffs in the West, but at least you're not going to be a 15-win team like you are basically this year. Or a 20-win team, to be fair, I suppose. Okay, so the next one I have on here is between Detroit and Milwaukee. I have Milwaukee getting Blake Griffin, and in return, Detroit getting Eric Bledsoe, Tony Snell, Ersan Ilyasova, and Dante DiVincenzo. Basically, DiVincenzo is just an incentive to say, here's a promising young player who we haven't really developed that much yet, but he adds to your wing depth, and you get a guy who could become a nice 6th man for you down the road. Besides that, you get Eric Bledsoe, who's an immediate upgrade over Reggie Jackson at the point guard spot. You get Tony Snell, who would probably start right away in your starting lineup. You'd probably, get him in there. And then Ersan Ilyasova, who's a nice spacer. Basically, what's the point of doing this for Detroit? They would be trying to remain competitive with this trade, but they'd just be basically exchanging star power and Blake for depth in the guys that they're getting. Starting lineup after this would probably look something like Eric Bledsoe, Reggie Bullock, Tony Snell, Ersan Ilyasova, and Andre Drummond. And then off the bench, you'd have Reggie Jackson, Ish Smith, Dante DiVincenzo, John Lure as your main guys off the bench. So again, it would sort of have to be a move out of them recognizing that they're not going to contend this year, maybe trying to rebuild a little bit. Along with that, Eric Bledsoe's money comes off the books after this year, and that's $15 million freed up. And along with that, Tony Snell, Ersan Ilyasova, and Dante DiVincenzo. Well, DiVincenzo has the same length of contract as Blake Griffin, but the other two have contracts that expire before Blake, so you get that money off the books sooner, and you add depth to your lineup. As for Milwaukee, you add a star player who can be a really nice number two to Giannis. I think that Blake Griffin, what he is he's not the star of a team. He's a really good number two on a title contender, much like he was with the Clippers. For Milwaukee, he can be your second man, and then you can have a starting lineup that looks something like probably George Hill at the 1. At the 2, you're going to have Chris Middleton. At the 3, Giannis. At the 4, Blake. At the 5, Brook Lopez. And then Malcolm Brogdon as your 6th man. I like that lineup a lot. You could also argue that they'd start Brogdon at the 1 and have George Hill come off the bench. That's totally possible. But I just think George Hill fits more of a traditional point guard role. That being said, I like this trade for Milwaukee a lot. I like it for Detroit somewhat, but I think they might want like a first round pick as well from Milwaukee just to sweeten it. But I think Dante DiVincenzo is sort of like the sweetener in this deal already, when Milwaukee doesn't really have to give him up to get it done as far as salary, but they would just to incentivize Detroit to take the deal. Next trade I have on here is between Detroit and the Timberwolves. This one I think is honestly the most fair trade out of any of these ones I have on here. I have Detroit getting Jeff Teague, Andrew Wiggins, and Taj Gibson, and I have Minnesota getting Reggie Jackson and Blake Griffin. So now why does Detroit do this? You get 3 rotation players for 2. You get a small upgrade at point guard, but an upgrade. Jeff Teague is better than Reggie Jackson. You get an immediate guy you can start at your small forward spot in Andrew Wiggins. You get a defensive power forward, which will help their team a bit because they're okay on defense, but not great. And I think that Wiggins replaces Blake Griffin's offense somewhat, and Taj Gibson slots in for Blake at power forward. So you kind of replace everything you lost on the team, but then you basically also gain good defense in Gibson and another starting spot in Wiggins. So your starting lineup for Detroit after this trade probably looks something like Jeff Teague, Reggie Bullock, Andrew Wiggins, Taj Gibson, and Andre Drummond. For the Timberwolves, why would you do this trade? You basically get off of Wiggins' 5-year contract for Blake Griffin's 4-year contract. You also get a guy in Blake Griffin who's more committed to winning than I think Wiggins is, as we saw in that interview. He's not happy with the team not doing well. Okay, besides that, Jeff Teague and Reggie Jackson have contracts that are basically the same for this year and next year. Teague is making $19 a year. Jackson is making $17. Both can't really shoot that well. Both are just like all right point guards, but Reggie Jackson's a little bit worse. But then again, Blake Griffin is better than Wiggins, so you're kind of balancing that out there. Starting lineup for the Wolves after this trade probably looks something like Reggie Jackson, Josh Okogie, Robert Covington, Blake Griffin, and Karl Anthony Towns. And then off the bench, you're looking at Dario Saric and probably like Tyus Jones and Gorgui Dieng as your main guys off the bench. But I think this one is definitely the most fair. Each team is benefiting, I think. Detroit with a little bit more depth, Minnesota with the best player in the trade, and they're each somewhat addressing needs in that Detroit basically just needs more balance, I think, instead of just 2 great post players and nothing else. And Minnesota needs more of a star power punch that Wiggins can't really provide for them. For this last trade on here, I have Detroit trading with Philadelphia. I have Philadelphia getting Blake Griffin, and I have Detroit getting a first-round pick from Philly in the future, along with Markelle Fultz, Mike Muscala, and Wilson Chandler. So now why would Detroit do this? Muscala and Chandler are coming off the books after this year, so you're really only left with Markelle Fultz. And in exchange, you're basically saving $24 million, because that's the difference in money between Fultz's $8 million and Blake Griffin's $32. So you're basically after this season saving $24 million to do with as you please. You get Wilson Chandler or Mike Muscala, either of which you could start in place of Blake Griffin. You'd actually probably start both of them. You'd probably have a starting lineup that looks like Reggie Jackson, Reggie Bullock, Wilson Chandler, Mike Muscala, Andre Drummond, with probably Markelle Fultz as your sixth man. I would hope Markelle Fultz would see this move as a wake-up call and a fresh start, and then maybe he could get back on track and be a somewhat decent player, or at least an NBA caliber player. And then a first-round pick I think that they would need as well, just because you're basically trading Blake Griffin for money in this trade after this season if Markelle Fultz doesn't work out. So a first-round pick would sort of be some security that you're at least getting something back. And then for Philly, you're getting a guy that can really round out your starting lineup, and you can have a really potent five-man lineup of Ben Simmons, and then J.J. Redick, Jimmy Butler, Blake Griffin, and Joel Embiid. You get some spacing in Blake Griffin. He's shooting 36% from three this year. Oh, just to clarify, Blake Griffin's stats for this season, he's having a career year, probably his best season as a pro actually. 26 points a game, 8 rebounds, 5 assists, 1 steal a game, shooting 48% from the field, 37% from 3, 76% from the line, so pretty decent numbers all around. He's actually taking a ton of threes this year. He's taking 7 threes a game, shooting 37%, so that's pretty good. That being said, as I say, Philly gets him, so you complete their five-man lineup. You do lose a little bit of depth in that you lose one rotation player in Muscala, but you can play Blake Griffin like 36 minutes a night if you want to. So, he's a little injury-prone sometimes, but he's been pretty healthy last year and then into this year. So hopefully he's turned a corner in that regard. But I think that really, if you're Philly, you basically get a pretty complete team if you acquire Blake Griffin. This is probably the trade where I think the team getting Blake Griffin probably benefits the most, in that Detroit would basically be just saying like, we want to clear the decks and get salary cap for him, salary cap relief, and then Philly acquires an all-star player. So that being said, hope you guys enjoyed the video, hope you found it interesting, and if you agree or disagree with me, let me know in the comments. I'd be glad to hear from you. I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.